Okay, during the course of the next 20 minutes, I'm going to try and do a few quite difficult things. One of them is to keep all of you away from your mobiles and computers. I know a lot of you have work emails that you've got to do, in a very similar position myself. The second bit is obviously to try and keep you awake while talking about valuation. Now, a lot of you are receivers of Valuation Report. I actually represent the International Valuation Standards Council. So we are the overarching standards for valuation in all markets. To put it in your context, it's equivalent to IFRS, but for valuation. And what I'm going to do is try and give you a brief overview of some of what a valuer needs to do according to our standards. But at the same time, I'll go off piste and I'll touch on some of the issues that we've mentioned in relation to Basel III, in relation to property value, in relation to data, and some of the challenges that valuers are actually facing. Now, this slide here that you're looking at is basically the valuation standards. The top line is the general standard. So it is basically everything from your initial scope of work or terms of engagement all the way through to your final documentation and reporting. And it covers all asset classes. So that is what we would call tangible assets or real assets. So that's real estate, land, plant and equipment. It covers business valuation. It covers intangible assets, intellectual property, and it covers financial instruments. And underneath that, you can see that we have the asset standards, which are more asset specific. Now, one of the things that I've got to warn you about is I'm used to talking for about 3 hours on this topic. So I'm going to very much rely on Luca over here to tell me when I'm getting towards the end of my time. Now, how do we work with other countries? You all have different standards. I was speaking yesterday to the people from the Philippines. And how do we integrate with different requirements within different countries? Well, it's quite easy. In order to comply with IVS, you also need to comply with the legal, statutory, regulatory or other authoritative requirements appropriate for the purpose and jurisdiction of the valuation. And if there is any conflict with this, your valuation would not be compliant with international valuation standards. And looking at it, we have a number of bases of value. And there are different bases of value depending on what you are valuing. And these bases of value, one of the things very common about them is they're at a point in time. So many of you will have heard of market value. You will have obviously heard of investment value, liquidation value, fair value under IFRS 13. And one of the things when I was chatting to Richard over here about this presentation and looking at it in the context of secured lending, he asked me to give you a little bit more information on the basis of value. So I thought I'd talk you through 3 of the main bases. So one of them is market value. And this is the estimated amount for which an asset or liability should exchange on the valuation date between a willing buyer and a willing seller in an arm's length transaction after proper marketing and where the parties had each acted knowledgeably, prudently and without compulsion. It is a hypothetical transaction. So it's not like fair value where you're looking at the actual market participants. We don't take into account a special purchaser, someone who is willing to pay more than another person. And a lot of people, particularly banks, say, how long is the market value valid for? Well, unfortunately, it is valid at the date of valuation. You know, so these are valuations at a point in time. Another basis of value that we have is investment value. Now, investment value is not the same as market value. It is the value of an asset to a particular owner or prospective owner for individual investment or operational objectives. So market value would often be used for secured lending in most markets around the world. Investment value, we may be asked by investors, but it does not necessarily produce the same number. Another bit that a lot of you will look at, particularly in stressed markets, is liquidation value. And liquidation value is the amount that would be realized when an asset or group of assets is sold from a liquidation sale, with the seller being compelled to sell as of a specific date. But there's two different premises of value for this. There is an orderly transaction with a typical marketing period, and there's a forced transaction. Once again, these would not produce the same numbers. So it is very important when you're looking at liquidation value to understand, do I have as much time in the world as I want to sell it? Is it a very shortened period in which we're going to do it? Now, we've heard a lot of talk today about property value under 229 CRR. Now, at the moment, as Wolfgang very kindly explained, we have some issues as valuers. First of all, we have no agreed definition. We have a definition that is open to interpretation that mixes price with value, which are two very different things. Price may inform value. It is not necessarily value. So I'll give you an example. Let's say I have a house, and for some reason I spend £500,000 or euros, let's be more European, filling it with gold statues of myself. Believe it or not, that does not add 500,000 euros to the value of the villa. Some people would not want gold statues of me in it. I don't understand why, but apparently that's the reason. But what I'm using this is very much to illustrate the point to you that cost does not necessarily equate to value. So when we have this difference between price and value, it does cause us some issues in the definition. We also have no agreed methodology. So at the moment, we have something that's coming into law. We have valuers who don't know what the definition actually means, and they don't know actually what the methodology is to do it. And in addition to that, we also have the complication that we don't know who is doing it. Is this something going to be done internally by the banks who have the data, which would be wonderful news for us? Is it going to be done by the valuer? And if it is done by the valuer, and I'll get into this more detail in a while, there are different challenges in different markets. Not only are there challenges in terms of data availability, in some markets, the data may only go back 5 or 10 years, but even in markets that you might see as highly developed, there may not be that data outside the major cities or conurbations. And not only that, you have to divide that data into retail, industrial, office, residential. All of them will have different variants. I've also got colleagues who question that there is actually a property cycle. And that might seem strange to you, but at the very beginning, Luca mentioned a number of events. He mentioned Lehman Brothers. He mentions Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And then he mentioned coronavirus. Now, you could argue that all of these are actually outside a property cycle. These are things that happened that affected the property cycle, but they're not part of the property cycle. So the whole concept that you can always have this value at the lower end of the property cycle is also difficult for us. Wolfgang will know, sorry about that a colleague of mine in Australia who chairs our tangible assets board, he said, show me there's a property cycle in residential property in Australia. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, our values have gone up for the past 50 years. Where is the cycle in this? Where is the lowest point? So we think property value is a really good idea. It's not a basis of value. We believe that it should be based on market value, which is actually clear evidence. But I'd also like to point out to a number of you that there are a number of challenges in relation to this, and we're trying to look at these challenges and work out the best way we deal with them. Now, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about valuation approaches, and I'm going to go very briefly on this, but there's 3 main approaches: market approach, income approach, and cost approach. But underneath these approaches, there are loads of methods. The discounted cash flow is just one method under the income approach. And a valuer must select the most appropriate approach, but in times of uncertainty, they should probably use more than one approach. It's a way of double checking your valuation. So you might be using more than market income and cost approach. And to a certain extent, though we have these definitions, they're all really hybrid approaches, because when I use an income approach, a lot of my evidence will be market evidence. When I use a cost approach, a lot of my evidence will be market evidence yet again. Now, George very kindly mentioned data and inputs, and I was pointing out some of the challenges that we have in relation to data and inputs, because not all markets have the same level of data. And when you're looking at these things globally, it can be difficult. But a valuer has to maximize the data they've got available. And the overarching characteristic is relevant and observable data, but we also give other characteristics. So accurate. The data should be free from error and bias and reflect the characteristics that they are designed to measure. Complete. The set of data is sufficient to address the attributes of the assets or liabilities. Timely. Data reflects the market conditions as of the valuation date, and transparent. The source of data can be traced from the origin. Now, not all data will have all of these characteristics. So what does a valuer have to do? He has to maximize as many of these characteristics as possible. And to do this, he uses his professional judgment, which is partly the art part of valuation, but also professional skepticism. You've got to look at the data, check that it's fit for purpose. You have to verify that data. You can't just take it at face value. Now, IVS 106, and I'm going very briefly through the general standards, deals with documentation and reporting and gives all the requirements for a valuation report. And one of the things valuers are not very good at, so I will confess, is they're not very good at giving the rationale for their valuation. And make sure you ask them for that. They should have that within their valuation report. Why did they use those comparables? Why did they pick that growth rate? Why did they use that yield? These are all things that valuers should be able to tell you. Now, before this, I haven't put it in this slide, but I may as well talk about it anyway, because it sort of came up a little bit. We have a section on valuation models. And within IVS at the moment, it states that no valuation model without a valuer's professional judgment, for instance, an automated valuation model, can produce an IVS compliant valuation. So if anyone is giving you an AVM as a valuation, that would not be compliant under IVS. That does not mean that you cannot use it as a tool within the valuation. We have many tools that we use, and it's a very important tool to use, but to stick numbers in a black box, come out with an answer, not understand the risks or the way the black box works, does not produce an IVS compliant valuation. So I thought I'd just highlight that. Now, I'm not sure on the time, and there's one or two other bits that I want to talk about, but I just talk a little bit about tangible asset standards, because it's come up quite a bit at the moment, and it's in relation to inspection. So quite a lot of people feel that residential assets don't need to be inspected. I would argue, and you can argue against me, I do enjoy a good discussion, that might be one of the issues with Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, that they took things at face value and they didn't actually inspect the assets and to see that they're worth what they're worth. And we don't say inspection is mandatory. What we say is sufficient investigations and evidence must be assembled by means such as an inspection, inquiry, research, computation or analysis to ensure that the valuation is properly supported. And if we go around our members, which include all the main accounting firms, all the big VPOs around the world and a number of other organizations, you will find that different markets have different requirements. I was very surprised to be told by one market, inspection is mandatory, but none of us do it. And I'm like, well, what type of mandatory is that? So what we're really about is that you need sufficient evidence for what you're doing. There's very good reasons. If you're doing pipelines, there's no way you're going to walk across hundreds of kilometers and inspect them. If you're dealing with very large acres of agricultural land, probably a drone is a better way to inspect it. But there are requirements, and it should be logical. And do feel free to challenge valuers. I have quite fun doing it, and I would say you might enjoy it as well. You know, don't just take it as face value. They should be able to explain to you what they're doing and why they're doing it. Now, in terms of residential standards, we also have a hierarchy of evidence. Not all evidence is good. I remember one market in Asia where they decided that anything was published in a paper could be used as a comparable. So they began making up their own comparables and publishing them in papers to use them in their valuation. So you do need to check the comparables that are actually used. And we've got a list here: direct comparable evidence, indirect comparable evidence, general market data, and other sources. And our members will go into further detail in relation to these. So just before I pause, and I've done it very quickly, trust me, Luca's heard longer versions and there are recordings as well. I did have a question very kindly from Richard, and it was basically asking me, and sorry to put you under the spot, Richard, but, you know, it's all part of the fun, I suppose. But his question was in relation to something that we get a lot of negative feedback. And it's the difference in valuation between public and private markets. And why is there such a difference? I can point to you during the crisis that with some REITs in Germany, the difference between the actual value of the REIT and the underlying asset value reached 60 to 70%, which is a massive amount. And people were saying, this is a sign that valuers are doing everything wrong. And it's not. Really, what it is it's like comparing a motorcycle to a motor car. They are both vehicles, but they are very different. So if I look at some of the differences between public and private assets, if we deal with the asset traded, in public assets, they're normally fractional interest or share. In private assets, it's typically the whole asset, underlying title or significant ownership. Liquidity is higher for public assets. It's a lot lower for private assets. The shareholders or owners of public assets, there's many. For private assets, there are a lot fewer. In the sale timeline, if I look at public assets, it can be very short. It can be a millisecond, a click of a button. If I look at private, it's 3 to 12 months to make a sale. If I look at control, public, low to nil, a private, high to complete. And the factors go on. In fact, we will be publishing a perspective paper, which is often a precursor to standard setting, and I'll make it available to Luca, who will make it available to all of you, that will be looking at this difference between private and public markets. We're also shortly publishing our second perspective paper in the series on TAB, on ESG and real assets, and how you quantify that in the valuation process. But the main thing I want to leave you here, don't be afraid to challenge the valuer. You know, there are processes that we need to follow. There are requirements that we need to follow, and they should be able to explain your rationale and how they've complied with international valuation standards. So, very quick overview here. Happy to take hundreds of questions. I didn't use my joke today, which I'll throw in. People often ask me, what's the difference between an asset and a liability? And I always say, it depends on your perspective. I see myself as an asset. My wife, she sees me as a liability. So I'll leave you on that line, but happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you.